Wow, twinned knight swords. So this has gone a bit Darth Maul, hasn't it? Where to start? There are lots of issues with just joining two swords end to end. Hi there, I'm Matt Easton of the HEMA Club and YouTube channel Schola Gladiatoria, and we teach people how to use weapons according to historical martial arts systems. Everything from daggers and knives through swords up to spears and poleaxes. I also consult for museums and the TV and movie industries. And today I'm going to be reacting to some of the weapons from Elden Ring. Okay, so it's a longsword. Longsword's pretty much one of the most typical weapons that we teach in HEMA, Historical European Martial Arts. There's absolutely tons of historical treatises showing us different styles from Germany and Italy and elsewhere of how to use these weapons. And this looks like a really typical late 14th century, if it was a historical one, longsword, which you can use with one hand or two. So if you're riding on a horse, you'd use it with one hand usually. If you're fighting on foot and not using a shield, then you'd usually use it with two hands. It's sometimes known as a hand and a half sword also. And this looks pretty much like a typical real-world 14th century longsword. I love the detail there that you can see that the spear has got significantly greater reach than the sword. And in fact, while swords get all the glamour and glory in movies and video games, in fact, in reality, the spear was the most successful hand-to-hand combat weapon throughout history, from the ancient period all the way through really until firearms were invented. And then of course the bayonet was invented, which turns your gun into a spear effectively in close combat. So the spear has superior reach, and I like the way that they've represented that here in this little encounter, and the fact that, you know, he blocked with a shield, stabbed with a spear, perfectly good stuff. So that kind of roll looks really awesome. I have actually seen people doing that in sparring. It's plausible. I think this game perhaps favors the roll a lot more than was ever done in real fights, but nevertheless. One detail I would say is we see here he thrusts straight into the middle of the person's chest. In reality, this would be one of the most well-protected areas. I can see that this person's wearing a mixture of chainmail and plate armor. In reality, if you were going to thrust anywhere, you thrust to the face. He's got an open face helmet, which was very common for reasons of vision and breathing and talking and everything else. So thrust to the face would have made more sense than the thrust to the torso. Why thrust at the area that's the most heavily armored? You thrust at the place that is the least heavily armored. So yeah, the stab placement is a bit weird there. He seems to have stabbed him in his behind, to use the polite word. This could be an area that's got less armor, I guess. Again, if you snuck up behind someone, it might make more sense to slit their throat or something like this. But I do like the detail that he has to use his foot to push the person's body off his blade. This is something that's often forgotten about, even by people who are training with blunt weapons in sparring on a regular basis, because we use blunt weapons, they don't enter a person's body, of course, because that would be a bad thing. With a modern fencing foil or a reenactment sword or a HEMA sword, they flex. So if you thrust someone, the blade flexes and you can immediately do something else with the sword. In reality, any type of sharp blade, doesn't matter whether it's a sword or a knife or a spear, it enters the person's body, and in that moment your weapon is essentially immobilized in their body. And there's lots of historical accounts of, in that moment, the person doing the stabbing themselves getting either stabbed or hit by their opponent or someone else, because they can't defend with their weapon while it's in the other person's body. So it's really important to remember that when weapons go into something, they have to come back out again. So I love that they've included that detail here. I love the way that they're showing some guard positions there. So this guard position up here in the Treatise of Fiore di Libri, which I teach from, which is a early 15th century Italian treatise, that would be called Posti di Finestra, which means the window position. It doesn't matter where you look in the world. We've got historical treatises from Japan, from China, from Korea, all over the world. You see the same positions, the same what we call guard positions, coming up again and again when you have a weapon that's similar. So with two-handed swords, this is a very common guard position. So it's great to see them including it here. A sickle. An interesting choice of weapon. Obviously, sickles are agricultural tools used for things like harvesting grass to turn into hay and things like this. Could you use one as a weapon? Yes. Were they ever used as weapons? There are some treatises. In fact, there's one specific treatise, Paulus Hector Mare, from the middle of the 16th century, that actually shows training with sickles. And these were regarded as a peasant weapon, because if you imagine that you're a farmer in the fields, you stop at the middle of the day and have a couple of jugs of beer, and you get into an argument with another one of the farmers, and the only weapons you've got to hand are sickles. So they're in no way a good weapon, but like anything that's sharp or pointed, you can use it as a weapon. They have their weaknesses, and they're probably not that strong to use as weapons, and there are certain things you can't really do with them. But yeah, let's see. Now you've got to bear in mind, if someone comes at you with a sword and a shield and all you've got is a sickle, you are in such big trouble. So sword and shield is an awesome combination. So you better be hoping that you've got way more skill than the person you're fighting. So do you know what? I actually love that, because he's using evasion, he's using rolling, he's coming around the back and side of the person. This is actually tactically the exact right thing to do. And again, he's slashing and going for weak points. Think about, where would you slash with a sickle? Hamstrings, back of the arms. So these kind of weak points. Oh wow. Okay, so that's it's big. When I first saw it, I wasn't sure whether it was edged on both edges. It looks like it's single-edged, so it's kind of like a giant saber. The consequence of that is it will have an enormous amount of striking power, but will be very difficult to control. I do like the detail of the fact it's resting on the shoulder, because that really shows that the game designers have acknowledged the reality of trying to hold a weapon like this in one hand. And absolutely, if for some reason you had to carry a shield because lots of people were going to shoot at you, and you were carrying a greatsword in one hand, then yeah, you absolutely would rest it on your shoulder. A spinning attack. I love it. I mean, that would, in theory, be a way to charge up a massive swing with a greatsword held in one hand. In reality, if you were fighting against a competent opponent, they would just step out of the way, and then as you swung through, they'd come in and nail you however they wanted. But yeah, it sort of makes physical sense in this scenario, I guess. So now he's slung the shield on the back and he's got it in two hands. Great. So yeah, I mean, there is a logic there. I can understand why he had the shield when he was being shot at, and now he's slung it on his back, presumably because he thinks, okay, I need to wield this sword a little bit more quickly and dexterously, so absolutely going to switch to using it in two hands, which is the way that a greatsword absolutely is intended to be used. So I really like a detail of how he's placing his hand. He's actually doing the back of his fist on the back of the blade there. This is close to what we would call half swording, which essentially means taking your left hand from the hilt and moving it up to the blade in a number of different ways. And this means that you're now using the weapon more like a pole weapon, more like a staff, more like a quarter staff. And that is better for certain type of blocking against heavy weapon attacks. It's also much better for fighting in armor when you want to come in close to wrestling distance and use the weapon like a staff to aid you in throwing or tripping or pushing, also to help you assist with aiming of getting the point into gaps in armor. So I like that they've shown that. It's another way that big two-handed swords can be used. What this weapon looks like, how it moves, they do marry up. So the way it's moving on screen does look like how a real weapon like this would actually move. It looks like it's tip heavy. It looks quite unwieldy, in fairness, but obviously it's going to hit with a lot of force as well. So I like when what you see on screen marries up to the nature of the movement and the fact that he's putting his whole body, he's using the twist of his hips, the placement of his legs, he's swinging it like it is a heavy object, because it is. Oh, twinned knight swords. So this has gone a bit Darth Maul, hasn't it? Where to start? There are lots of issues with just joining two swords end to end. I'm not going to say it's a useless weapon, because you can hold it in the middle and use it kind of like a quarterstaff, but you've got various issues here, including the strength and integrity of the weapon, the fact that you're quite limited in the area of where you can actually grip it. Unlike a staff, you can slip your hands down to one end, flip around, swip to the other end. With this, you can only hold it in the middle. So in terms of versatility, this is actually worse than a pole weapon. The final thing I want to say about this one is I find it super weird, given that this is supposed to be knights' swords, that they have cup hilts on them. So the cup hilt is something which is particularly popular in Spain and southern Italy in the 17th century. So this is kind of like after the age of armoured knights. And when I see a cup hilt, I think of musketeers and the English Civil War and the 30 Years' War and things like this. I don't think about medieval knights. So it's not at all a knight's sword. This is more like a duelist sword, I would call it, or a musketeer's sword. I've got issues with this sword, but yeah, you could use it. You know, you could. I guess you could do some things with it. It might be fun. I mean, that's problematic on so many levels. The problem is holding it in one hand. It's going to be so unwieldy, especially with a massive shield in the other hand. If you just used it to stab, you can stab from different angles, exactly like you do with a spear, be absolutely fine. But trying to get your edge alignment correct, one-handed, with this type of weapon and generate enough force to do effective cuts, when a thrust would be more effective and easier. No, that's the wrong way to use that weapon. I do like the use of the spikes on the shield, though. I've got no problems at all with that. Very, very cool. Now the game's changed because he's now holding it two-handed, so he can now use it. It's easier to get to index the edge and get the edge line, and you can get a lot more leverage into it, and you can use it like a staff now. You can use it like a pole weapon. Yeah, you see, I don't have a big problem with that. He's using it essentially exactly how we see a staff would be used particularly in Chinese systems. So I think that the movements that they've got in this have probably been based on Wushu Kung Fu, which is, in fairness, quite choreography-centric. It's quite stage and screen centric, but nevertheless, yep, you can use a staff weapon like that. Getting the edges aligned is always going to be difficult, but let's just say that he's extremely practiced at it. There is a real-world parallel for this. There's an Indian weapon. It's much smaller than this, but it's called the bagnak. But they're essentially a steel thing with two rings. You put two of your fingers through, and then the claws are on the inside of your palms. They don't project out like Wolverine. They sit on the inside. And the whole point is you can have them inside your fist. They're a concealed weapon, and nobody knows that they're there. Okay, so this is literally more like Wolverine's bone claws. I guess one of the historical real-world parallels for this is, again, an Indian weapon called the katar. I actually have one here by pure coincidence from the 18th century with a nice gold decoration on the hilt. A katar is a punch dagger, and that is held like that. So you can see it's not very similar, and you can cut these ways, and obviously mostly it's used to punch, and you'll notice it's got a reinforced point for punching through chainmail or padded armor. So they exist, but they're quite different to this. These are more like the claws because you can't stab forwards with these very easily. They look more like raking or slashing weapons like we see with Wolverine's claws. So I'm quite happy to see that his opponents have got no armor, because I was going to say these would be useless against metal armor. But against unarmored people, yeah, they're going to be pretty horrific and do lots of damage. A little bit like having a series of sickles attached to your hands, I guess. The guy with the massive mace, which is enormous, it looks like a Christmas tree. In a straight up fight between two equal people, the person with the massive mace would probably, I don't know, if they could lift it, they'd have the advantage, but it's so big and heavy, it's kind of going to have a massive overswing. The problem with these claws is they've got very short reach. They're the same reach basically as a knife. So against people with longer weapons like swords and maces and spears and pole weapons, you're always going to be at reach disadvantage, which means they can hit you sometimes multiple times before you're even close enough to hit them back. So one thing I really like is the way that he's avoiding there. He's kind of like shooting backwards and rolling and this kind of stuff. And with this type of weapon, that's what you've got to do. Really, if you've got these big kind of Wolverine-like claws, the only defense I can think of, if the attack comes in, you could do what we call is a beat or a rebat, which means to swipe away. So if the motion is coming towards you, if you swipe from the side, you deflect the energy off to the side. So deflecting from side to side could work. And the other thing you could do is put both claws together like a shield in front of you to block like that. So theoretically you could block with these, but against a mace it would be completely stupid. You're not going to be able to deflect it easily. You're not going to be able to just stop it. So avoiding is the right thing to do. So I actually quite liked this selection of weapons. I guess my least favourite was the double-ended sword for a number of reasons. If you chopped it in half and made it into separate swords, each one of those would have looked like a beefed up cup hilt rapier, which would have looked really cool. But joined together, they just made no sense, and I didn't like the way that they showed them being used. And why cup hilts? Why have cup hilts on them? That only really makes sense with a rapier. But all of the other weapons I basically quite liked, and I liked the way that they showed them being used. It looked like they'd thought about it. I particularly like the claws, actually. Despite the fact there's no real world parallel for those claws in weaponry, we have to remember, what is a bear armed with? What is a tiger armed with? Big old claws. You know, we can't say that those big claws don't make sense, because they clearly make sense in nature. These are the primary armament of a whole bunch of really big, powerful and scary animals. Obviously, the longsword was a completely typical longsword, and I liked the fact that they were showing quite a bit of thrusting with it. That's well thought out. That's good. And I liked the guard positions that were shown. And the big, top-heavy greatsword, I didn't hate it. It was okay. I think I would have design it a bit differently to either make it look more extreme and more fantasy, or to make it look more sensible. It looked like it was sitting a bit too much in the middle ground. It hadn't gone enough fantasy and it hadn't gone enough sensible, and I didn't really understand why he was using it. A normal greatsword like a Zweihander would have made more sense, I think. But overall, I actually quite liked these weapons, and I think they were not ridiculous. They were not massively over fantasy. They looked believable. They looked decently proportioned for the most part, and I liked the different ways that they'd thought about how they might be used.
For more videos like this one, make sure to stick with IGN for our upcoming part 2 on Elden Ring, or you can watch Matt Easton reacting to the weapons in God of War.